former Fulton County District Attorney and Sheriff.
Formerly a judge, and he knows a little bit about how these things go.
From Mohawk Valley, legal eagle, lawman.
He is the Sheriff of Fulton County, New York. Just such an amazing guy.
This is the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.
This is the Rich Giardino Show. I'm Rich Giardino, your host, and on today's program, we have a special guest for July 4th, Peter Betz. Peter's a former historian in Fulton County, New York, and we are producing this from Fulton County today. And I have I'd like to introduce Peter. Peter, how long were you the historian of Fulton County?
I believe it was 2006 through the middle of 2013.
And your history, your interest in history, how did that start, so our listeners know?
Well, actually, kind of in a silly way. When I was a kid, every now and then I'd get tired of school and I'd pretend I had a sore throat and stay home for a day. And my father had a lot of the local history books, and I would grab one of them when I was done with my latest comic, and I would start reading it, and I became interested in it way, way back then.
So people understand. So at the time, 1776 and before, Fulton County was not an independent free county. There had been several counties joined together. So what was New York State cut up as when the British, when we became colonies?
Well, for our immediate concern, in 1772, Sir William Johnson petitioned the colonial legislature to cut off everything west of Schenectady, basically, and form a new county. And that was, he was smart enough not to try and name it after himself for once. And he appealed to Governor Tryon, who was actually one of the more decent and capable and the very last British colonial governor we had. And he said, let's name it after you, sir. And who could resist that? I'm sure you wouldn't mind having Giardino County, you know?
Correct.
So that, of course, got the governor on his side. And it was basically everything west of Schenectady, north, south, and west, down to the Pennsylvania border on the south side, up to Canada on the north side, and all the way west in the wilderness, what now comprises Hamilton, Fulton, Montgomery, Schoharie, Herkimer counties, everything. It was the wilderness beyond, let's say beyond Rome was the true wilderness, what we think of Rome today.
So how many counties were there in the state in the colonial era?
Well, you had them already formed in the Hudson Valley and on the way up from New York, but like I said, everything west of Schenectady was not, set up in any kind of a county government situation.
So people understand. So Sir William Johnson was he appointed by the king, or how did he? What was his title up here, and how did that all start?
Well, he was the superintendent of the Indians, and it was the job that A, nobody wanted, and B, really, he was probably the one person capable of doing it, because from his earliest arrival in 1738, he had befriended them, and some of the more important ones, like King Hendrik, had befriended him, and he learned their language. And of course, later on, he had his maybe marriage, but definitely his permanent connection with Molly Brant, who was the daughter of another important Mohawk. And of course, they had like 8 children. So, and then he also became their military leader, actually sort of by accident in a way. He was not the commander in the first battle of Lake George, but the commander was taken out of service, and Johnson became the de facto commander, won the battle, won the king's recognition and approval. And, they started saying, hey, this guy can do it. you
So
know?
let me ask you this. So that's why we became known as the Mohawk Valley, because of the Mohawk Mohegans, right?
Oh, yes, Mohawks, not Mohegans.
Yeah. And then what happens is, before 1776 and the Declaration of Independence that we knew from the 13 colonies, you mentioned something interesting to me the other day about, so Sir William Johnson was probably one of the first politicians who knew what he was doing in a corrupt way, and explained that about how many acres the king would give and what he did to have. How many acres did he end up with ultimately?
Oh, God, 180,000 at least, and several different patents. I wouldn't say it corrupts the matter. It's almost like he kind of designed the system, if you will, and he designed it to work for him. Although he was not the only one doing this kind of thing. No, the Board of Trade, the British Board of Trade was a very powerful organization next to the king. And they set up this deal where any one individual could only patent 2,000 acres and no more. So Johnson would come along with, and the Indians would say, yes, you can have this land, just, make it happen. And let's say there was 40,000 acres in a particular patent. In other words, my math is correct. That's, it would be two, yeah. Well, anyway, my math is pretty bad. So Johnson couldn't patent those 40,000 acres by himself. What he had to do was get X number of people together, each one of them, all of his friends and people that wanted to be his friends, and said, yes, sir, we'll go along with this. And each one of them would put their name down on the patent application for 2,000 acres. So you would have this list of patentees on the application. The application would be approved. Each one of these people would immediately sign their 2,000 acres over to Sir William Johnson.
So that's how he accumulated so much property and more power. So you're listening to the Rich Giardino Show. It's a special July 4th edition. With me is Peter Betz, a former Fulton County historian, and we're talking a little bit about Sir William Johnson. And this is a few years prior to 1776 when the Declaration was signed. The question I have is in order to keep these programs going and conversations like this, I need you to like, share, and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, and Apple, and anywhere else that fine podcasts are showing, and my podcast. So, Peter, tell us a little bit about then, how is it that New York kind of led the way or had their own declaration as a state? When did that happen, and how did it come about? And was it similar to the Declaration of Independence?
Well, this has to do with the Palatines, okay? The group of people who left Germany in 1702 or 3 and came to England. And for a while they were welcomed and fed and looked after. But then one of these days, people started scratching their heads and say, okay, what do we do with these people? They're starting to cost us money. So they sent them to America, and they ended up in the Hudson Valley with Governor Hunter was the colonial governor at the time. He had a scheme. His scheme was to take down thousands and thousands of fir trees, sell the trees themselves once they were debarked as masts for British ships, and also to have the bark and various other things turned into tar, because the tar was a very important product. They were constantly tarring ships, patching leaks, and that sort of thing. So they said, great, we'll take all these people, we'll put them down there, we'll make it work. And he victualized them, he fed them. And they got there, they started working, and this went on for a year or so. And then all of a sudden they discovered, whoops, these trees aren't the right kind of trees for tars. They aren't the right kind of trees for masts. Hunter lost a lot of money on it. And what happened basically was one day he just stopped feeding them. So a lot of them went to Schoharie. They were invited to Schoharie. The Indians were very good to them down Schoharie. 2 generations later, they would be booting the Indians out of Schoharie, but that's another story. That's
Who
another
needs
story.
friends like that?
Yeah, right. So then, yes, they're in Schoharie. They're working industriously for 40 some years. They think they own the land. Well, what happened is some speculators bought up the Schoharie patent, the land, and said, okay, you guys can stay, but you have to sign a deed and you have to pay. And a lot of them weren't about to do that. So a goodly number went to Pennsylvania, but another group came right up here. And I'll explain why this is important in a minute. Think about it in a minute. These people had been done in and done out of everything 2 or 3 times. And they were very, very sensitive to their rights. And we're speaking mainly about the 23 families that settled in Stone Arabia, west of Johnstown, in 1723. And once again, worked hard, worked industriously, and the Mohawk Valley in general, I don't know if it was Washington or who, but one person called it the breadbasket of the Mohawk Valley. In other words, such fertile fields and so much produce could be accumulated and was taken down to Albany and to the military stores for Washington's army, things like that. But that's getting a little bit ahead of it. I set up a little timeline, and if we think of it this way, okay, 1772 we have Tryon County. There's 5 districts. Okay, they weren't towns like we think of them. They were districts. You had the district of Palatine, Canajoharie, Kingsland, German Flats, and Mohawk, and that's the whole center of the valley, heading west toward Rome, and on the south side of the river, and on the north side of the river. Okay, and now here's what happens. Sir William Johnson dies. Okay, he dies July 11th, 1774, and the very first meeting of what would become the Tryon County Committee of Safety was held August 27th, which was just, a very short time after he passes away. And we have the minutes, fortunately, of these meetings. We know what's going on. And the first meeting was just the Palatine Committee. They formed their own committee right up there in Stone Arabia. It wasn't the whole county yet. And it was called the Committee of Correspondence. In the early times, their main function was to be informed, to know what was going on outside and know as soon as they could, and to communicate with the other towns and counties, Schenectady, for example, Albany, and to be conscious of things. So
you mean, Peter, we didn't have the internet back then?
Not hardly, not even the operator on the telephone. Anyway, August 27th, 1774. Okay, this little group of people met in Stone Arabia, and they created a document. And at that time, there wasn't yet any thought of seceding from Britain. Okay, and the first item says, King George is a lawful king, and so forth and so on. But the third one was the important one, and I'll quote just briefly: that we think it is our undeniable privilege to be taxed only with our consent given by ourselves. Okay, the taxes otherwise laid and exacted are unjust and unconstitutional, and an obvious encroachment in the rights and liberties of the British subjects in America. See, they were very much concerned about what their rights were, and how to obtain them. And then let's see. We go. very shortly, the district committees formed, and they formed one. It was essentially a government, okay, a government with no authority except their own. They formed what became known as the Tryon County Committee of Safety. And when the Johnsons left, when they threw off Sheriff White, who was a rabid Tory Kingsman sheriff, they literally ran the county for almost 2 years, government-wise. What did they do? They had everything from civil government, like road commissions to make sure the roads were kept open. A large number of them had newspaper subscriptions for both Albany and New York papers. They paid to have them delivered once a week, so they knew more about what was going on. They had trials. They arrested Tories, took their property over, and literally governed. And we have all the minutes from these things. One of their earliest concerns, and they wrote about when the British blockaded the port of Boston.
Okay.
You'd think that was far away and nobody would care around here, but it was a very serious thing. They sent wheat, they sent peas, everybody did. And it was kind of a joke that Boston was better off under blockade with everybody donating foodstuffs and things to Boston than it had been before. Anyway, then let's see. I'm trying to do this all as quickly as I could. Yeah, the Palatine. Yeah, let me just read this into it. The third document by this, and this is still just the Palatines, just the people in Stone Arabia, but they're forming county-wise. They sent a letter to the Albany Committee asking for help in organizing. And they said, among other things, this county has for a series of years been ruled by one family, the different branches of which are still strenuous in dissuading the people from coming together into congressional measures, and even have last week at a numerous meeting of the Mohawk District appeared with all their dependents armed to oppose the people from considering their grievances. That's what they're talking about, the Liberty Pole.
Okay.
You recall the Liberty Pole was put up, and then a large group of Johnson and the Butler family retainers came down and dispersed the whole thing. That's
So
what this refers.
It's interesting because the previous meeting, they were complaining about taxes, which is always a complaint about being overtaxed.
Right.
So it started back, before the Declaration of Independence,
Oh, yes.
when they wanted freedom from the Great Britain, telling them they're going to take their money, they're going to take their property, they're going to take, things they have worked for. So it's funny that taxes are still, a problem, with everybody.
In the very end of this letter, if I can just read it, it is our fixed resolution to support and carry into execution everything recommended by the Continental Congress and to be free or die. That was strong stuff back then.
So that's a precursor, would you say, to the Declaration of Independence then?
Well, very much as far as the intention of the Declaration of Independence, yes, I would say so.
So who did they send from New York or upstate New York to represent us? Do you remember?
Well, let's see. That comes a little bit later. The prominent people would have been Christopher Yates, who was actually a Schenectady gentleman, but he had married the daughter of John Fry, who was a very prominent member and actually became the first sheriff, first of our sheriffs. Okay. And he was an attorney and literate, and he was one of the people that was sent. Isaac Paris was another. Paris was the main storekeeper and sort of one of the definite leaders of the Palatines up in Stone Arabia. and other people, some of them as well. Anyhow, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. 21st of May, they finally had created the countywide organization of committees. They were all one now, and they were meeting like every second or third day, going on forever. And again, they put out a document, and the last line, if I may read that we abhor a state of slavery. We do join and unite together with all of the ties of religion, honor, justice, and love for our country, never to become slaves, and to defend our freedom with our lives and fortunes. Kind of amusing when you think every darn one of them had slaves.
Yeah. So they had slaves, but they were complaining about being slaves, but their complaints rested in the fear of their property being taken or the goods they produced or being taxed, right? So
Right, exactly.
it's interesting where that comes from. What other ties did we have from now Fulton County, then Tryon County, to the Declaration and to the founding?
Well, we would have sent people to the Continental Congress, which of course was where the Declaration came from. They were I didn't put that down. I can't be specific on that, but we were represented. That's the main thing I can tell you.
What else is significant as we celebrate July 4th that people should think about in terms of history to remind them of the importance of July 4th and to remind them of the Declaration, then followed by the Constitution? I
Well,
know I didn't tell you that question ahead of time, but I mean, as a
no,
historian, what
it's
is your
just
hope that people remember and learn from history about the
it's
Declaration?
just an all-encompassing question. That's the only reason why I hesitate. Uh, the committee, I wouldn't call it a fault. They were naturally trying to identify and to round up their enemies, i.e. the Tories and loyalists, and did so. Beyond that, they were governing in a very democratic manner. And assuming all the powers of government, some of which they probably didn't even want, but the main thing was to keep the system going. And the kind of thing that amused me was after a while, I got the kind of feeling from reading these minutes, they liked it. They
Like the authority,
liked
power.
the authority. But of course, the first state legislature met in February of '78. And most of the committees had almost immediately dissolved. And the Tryon County Committee of Safety wasn't about to dissolve. And finally, in the middle of May, the new state government sent them a letter and said, "Hey, you guys are no longer necessary. Anything you do from now on, you might be sued for because you no longer have the authority to do it." And we are now the legally constituted state government. We take over from here, and so that was the very last letter in the last minutes. Which doesn't quite answer your question. The fervor, let's put it that way, the fervor for independence. It grew gradually. As you can see in the very beginning, they weren't talking about even thinking about separating from England. They just wanted to be taxed by themselves legally. That was the main gripe, okay? And then, of course, it grew and grew. We had the Boston Tea Party. We had the greater fervor for independence, which really aroused in New England and in Boston and Massachusetts in particular. But it spread just like COVID spreads. I mean, everybody said, "Yeah, these are great ideas. We can do this. We don't need England anymore."
So what's interesting to me about your comments, well, first, let me do a cheap pitch that I do. Please like, share, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, and other areas that you get your podcasts. In order for us to continue to grow this podcast and to continue to bring you guests of a variety to educate, enlighten you, and talk about the Constitution, crime, and politics. But Peter, so it really goes, even though it's 400 years ago, here's what it looks like. Government is still forgetting that they're for the people, by the people, and of the people, or of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so you had the natural tendency, government's trying to tell the locals what to do, which New York still does. And as we frequently refer to them as unfunded mandates, and that's
Yes,
around the country, and that's the federal government as well. So by design, it sounded beautiful, and in practice, we've lasted as long as we have, probably the longest Democrat Republic we've in the world, correct?
yes.
You know?
And I always go back to what Benjamin Franklin said when the day that they did the Declaration of Independence, they announced it, and they all came out, and there was some people standing around, and according to history, I wasn't there. According to history, a lady said, "Dr. Franklin, what form of government have you given us?" And he responded, a republic, dear lady, if you can keep it."
Mm.
That's the danger point. And that's sometimes where I wonder where we are right now.
We're at scary times. I want to thank our guest, Peter Betz, former Fulton County historian, for educating us not only on Fulton County, upstate New York, but a lot about what's going on, what went on in history and how it relates to today. I ask you to share, like, subscribe to the Rich Giardino Show podcast, if you will, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, and other programs. And Peter, I want to thank you for taking the time to discuss this with us. It's interesting because when it'll air the day that we're celebrating July 4th, and it'll stay online and stay alive for decades and hopefully for 200 years. But who knows what we'll have. But what's interesting to me is that there we forget they don't teach history the way they used to teach history. And the schools have, become they teach, but the reading, arithmetic, and writing have all gone by the wayside. So that they become the minority view and lesser than what the focus has been in several areas around the country. I still think that this country is very resilient. I think that we're gonna continue to survive regardless. Right now, we're in the throes of an election that is consequential to this country, to this state, and to individuals on a local. And we encourage people to get out and participate by voting and by running for office themselves. Again, I want to thank our guest, Peter Betz. Future programs we'll have will be Tim Diamond, New York State Police Investigative Unit president. I hope to have my friend, Professor Hutter from Albany Law School, to talk about the recent decisions with the Supreme Court. Thank you very much, Peter, and you have a good day.
Thank you, sir.
So what happens is they edit this, probably take some stuff out for time, and it'll air on. It goes online at like midnight on Thursday. Sometimes it doesn't make it. It gets sent to them at midnight. Sometimes it doesn't make it until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But I will send you the clips, Peter,
Right.
and I appreciate it. Was there anything I missed that I should have asked you?
No, not at all. I'm just going to make a suggestion to you, and I mentioned this before as far as the group that you had me speak at several years ago. I think it was your retired Fulton County.
It was the Fulton County Sheriff's Association about the history of sheriffs.
I could always do one on murders.
We got tons of those. I will probably have you.
Sometime when it isn't so important to be, to stress the political element, if you just want to do it for fun,
Yes.
I can go way back to 1811 on that one.
Yeah, we had a lot of murders in our county, and what's interesting is the last woman executed was Mrs. Van Valkenburg, and that name is familiar, obviously, throughout the
Yeah.
county. So it's very interesting. History is fascinating, and it's funny that it's the more we get away from it as a society, the more important it becomes. If that sounds right, am I mixing
Yeah,
my
yes.
words? I mean, what do they say? Who's the famous individual who said, if you forget history, you'll repeat it or whatever. What's the
Well,
phrase?
no, the thing was, let's see how to go. Yes, those who, I think those who
Forget history are bound to repeat
history
it.
are bound to repeat it.
Yep.
And my version of that is right now, all they're doing is making it worse.
Exactly. Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yep. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Like and subscribe to The Rich Giardino Show, part of the Elite Influencer Network, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time on The Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.